In this third Excel tip, we will have a look at how to analyze your data with pivot tables. Now, pivot tables are often the sort of mysterious things that people hear about. They think it's a very advanced feature, but in fact it's something that is very easy to use if you structure your data correctly. So, for example, let's have a look at our simple sample budget that we had from the previous videos. And now we have this data that has facilities, travel, and staff time, but let's say we want to calculate the per day costs. Well, at the moment, we would have to simply manually make a separate table and manually look up the data and calculate that. But this is where Excel would help us a lot with pivot tables. But can we go from this to something like this? So this is what a pivot table would look like. It would give us nice per day costs. It would give us the breakdown by per day category. It would even give us these slicers, these filters. All of these things are easy to do, but how can we go from here to here? And the answer is we cannot. And that is where most people get stuck because they think, oh, my data doesn't quite work well with pivot tables. So the pivot tables must be difficult. But actually, pivot tables are very easy. It is the data. So what we have to do, we need to restructure our data in a way that makes it susceptible to analysis. And what we really need to do is start thinking differently about our data. So if I'm doing a budget, I no longer do the traditional thing we saw, but I will actually structure it as sort of a database. So I will have more columns, and some of the columns will be categories and unit types, units, unit costs, and so on. And maybe even days if I want a day. So whatever I want to analyze by, I add a column, and I have to do a little bit of repetition in here. But actually, later on that will pay off with analysis. The other thing is this is a lot more difficult to read than the traditional way. But because I have pivot tables, I can then have multiple views of that same data. And so for example, like this, and so you see this is very easy to read. So I have all these options here for presenting the data and analyzing it if I have started with the data like this in a single table. If I did the thing that we traditionally do, then pivot tables will not be able to help me, and I will be much more limited in what I can do with my data. So this is an example of what I did with my conference budget. I reformatted, and now to create a pivot table, I simply convert that to a table, which I've done already. I click on it, go to Design, Table Design, and Summarize with Pivot Table. That will give me an option to open a new tab, which I did. And now inside here, I have this option to choose what I want to analyze it. So I wanted days, so I've done days. And you can see it gave me days here. And now I wanted to add up the totals for the day. So I clicked on day and total here. And Excel is clever enough, it figured out what I want. And I also, let's say, want category. So I clicked on, just simply ticked the boxes here in the fields that I have available in the table. And you can see Excel was clever enough to simply figure out what that should look like. So I didn't have to do any formatting, I didn't have to do a lot of thinking, it simply created this data. But there is a lot more that I can do with the pivot tables if I just learn a few more things. So as you can see, it's very easy to get started, but we can perhaps get even more if we simply learn a few things. So here's another thing that we can do. So we can add more data into the pivot tables, more information. So for example, I may want to be able to display this data in a different way. So one of the things I can do, I can choose what sort of calculation it is. I can even make it as a percentage of something else. But for now, I just want to format the number. So I want to make sure that it displays as currency. So I click on number format, currency, and then OK. So so it's these pull down menus that are important for me. So I drop down, I click on that pull down menu, I get something more. Now, as you can see, I can drag that same field into the values area multiple times, and as you can see now, that just shows up in the pivot table as multiple columns of the same thing. Well, that doesn't seem very useful, but I can then again do the same thing, get that pull down and value field settings, and for the next one I can choose count. So now I have a count of the items that this consists of. But I can do more. I can then go to the next column and choose show values as, and choose the calculation of percentage of grand total. So now all of a sudden in my Excel table, in my pivot table, I have not only the totals, I have the counts of how many things are being totaled up, and also I have the percentages of the total for each of those things. So with very simple, a few clicks here and there, I all of a sudden have data that otherwise would have taken me a lot of thinking, a lot of hard work, and it's only because I created the data structures correctly. the first time. Now, I can do more things with pivot tables, for example, by improving the formatting to suit my needs. So, for example, here I would go on the Design tab when I'm in the table, and I can simply choose color scheme, the same as with tables. You can see it's becomes much easier to read, but I can do a lot more. There's this layout options. I can choose the way I want to display the layout. So I can create an outline that looks like this. I can also create a table that looks like the more traditional way in which we display data. I can decide whether I want subtotals and grand totals, how I want them displayed. So I have all of these options where, as you can see, I can get rid of the subtotals to make it easier to read, and so on and so forth. So those are just some of the ways in which I can format the pivot table. So it's not only the data that goes in there, but also my ability to reformat it and display that data in a more attractive way. Now, so far I showed you something that would save you time and is useful, but perhaps we didn't feel like there was that much data, that we could have done that manually, even maybe if it would have taken more time. But of course, often you have data sets where you couldn't do that work at all because you have hundreds or even thousands of units in that pivot table. So here's an example of an online session attendance report that came from a system that I anonymized, and I will now want to go from something like this that has almost 1,000 entries into something like that will show me the monthly attendance, or maybe even per session attendance. So here I have the data. I start with, as usual, I simply convert that whole chunk into a table. It's not required for a pivot table, but it just gives me that integrity for later. I name my table as always, just to make sure, again, I always know what I'm working with. It's just like a good practice to have, even if it's not required. Then I click on Summarize the Pivot Table, open a new list, and I know that I want to have analysis by date. So I have the session date, so I click on date, and you can see Excel already figured it out that there are years and months in there. So I can now get that. So I want to now count the students. So obviously it just adds up the IDs, which is not useful, but so I go in there and I choose count. So now here I know how many students attended during each year, and then of course there's more detail in there. And then I want to, let's say, know how what was the average attendance. So I click on attendance duration, drag it into the values, or I could have just clicked it, would have figured it out, and choose as an option value field settings here, and I will now choose the average. And so now here I have an easy analysis of by year of the attendance and of the numbers of students. Of course, I also can go in there and make sure that I reduce decimal places, because for the average of attendance, I only want it to the minute. I don't particularly want it to a fraction of a minute. As you can see now, I can open this. It showed me quarters, months, and I could have also added sessions in there if I wanted to. And so I could have this nice table analysis. And again, it took me just a few clicks and a few things to know. But without a pivot table, this would have been very, very difficult. It would have taken me a lot of formulas and a lot of potential for errors, whereas the pivot table makes this a lot easier. So here are some other things to know about pivot tables. They don't refresh automatically, so that's how they're different from formulas. You have to click on the refresh button every time you change your data. But the other thing that you may not realize, you can make multiple pivot tables of the same data. So it's not just the one pivot table that you constantly have to change. You can set one up that works for you and then duplicate it, or just create a new one that has a completely different view of the same data. And you can also add columns in the pivot tables that are not in the data. So the pivot tables can be used to calculate even more things so you're not necessarily limited to just what's directly in the data. So a quick summary. To remember, before you start your pivot table, always put your source data in a single table. Make sure it's treated almost like a database. Make sure that the separate info that you want to analyze by is in separate columns. And also make sure that you convert it to a table to make sure that you keep your data integrity. Then once you're in a pivot table, start with just simply letting Excel pick your defaults automatically. Just simply pick a few things and see what Excel suggests. Then make sure that you adjust the settings later to suit your needs. So don't worry that the thing that Excel gave you is perhaps unsuitable. And finally, make sure that you experiment with the formatting. So don't necessarily think that Excel limits you to just the first thing they chose you. Now, of course, pivot tables are very powerful and allow you to do many, many things. And one way to learn more is to go to lynda.com, which is available for all Oxford University students, faculty, and staff, and search for pivot tables. And there will be many courses or individual videos on how you can use pivot tables to analyze data. So thank you very much for watching these tips, and please go on the Did You Know website. Do let me know if you have any other questions, and I hope this has been useful. Thank you.